There are few professions that earn the unconditional trust of a community in the way firefighters do. Long before anyone learns their names, people recognize the sound of their sirens and instinctively believe that help has arrived. When smoke begins to rise above a neighborhood, families rush away from the danger while firefighters move in the opposite direction. Their job demands courage that most people hope they will never have to test. Every alarm they answer carries uncertainty. Every burning building hides risks that cannot be seen from the outside. Yet they enter anyway, driven by the belief that someone inside may still need saving. For more than 2 decades, Ethan Brooks lived by that belief. He was not the loudest member of the Seattle Fire Department, nor the most decorated, but he had earned something far more valuable than medals. He had earned the quiet respect of the people who worked beside him and the gratitude of the families whose lives he had helped save. New recruits often sought his advice because he remained calm under pressure, and senior officers trusted his judgment during the most dangerous operations. Over 23 years of service, he had entered hundreds of burning structures, rescued strangers he would never meet again, and accepted that every shift could be the one that changed his life forever. On an unusually cold evening in October, that moment finally arrived, but not in the way anyone could have imagined. Shortly after 9 o'clock, emergency dispatch received multiple reports of heavy smoke pouring from a large warehouse on the industrial waterfront. Fire crews were immediately deployed. Ethan's engine company was among the first to arrive. Thick black smoke covered the loading bays, flames burst through the roof within minutes, and sections of the building began collapsing before firefighters could establish complete control of the scene. It was the kind of fire every experienced firefighter feared, because conditions changed faster than anyone could predict. The blaze was finally extinguished after several exhausting hours, but the morning revealed a discovery that transformed a tragic accident into the beginning of a criminal investigation. Deep inside the ruins, investigators recovered the body of Daniel Mercer, a well-known local entrepreneur whose company had leased part of the warehouse. Detectives initially believed they were dealing with a fatal industrial fire. That assumption lasted less than 48 hours. A preliminary forensic assessment suggested the blaze might have been deliberately started. Overnight, the focus shifted from determining how the victim had died to identifying who had started the fire. As investigators reconstructed the final hours before the incident, one unexpected name began appearing repeatedly in internal reports. It was not the warehouse owner, an employee, or a business rival. It was Ethan Brooks, the firefighter who had spent the night battling the flames. At first, the suggestion seemed impossible. His service record was exemplary, his reputation impeccable, and there was no obvious motive connecting him to the victim. Yet investigators insisted they had found scientific evidence that pointed directly toward him. Newspapers quickly picked up the story. Television channels repeated anonymous leaks from the investigation, and within days a man once celebrated as a public servant found himself portrayed as the prime suspect in one of the city's most shocking murder cases. What neither the public nor the jury would discover until many years later was that the prosecution's case rested almost entirely on a forensic conclusion that appeared authoritative but concealed a devastating flaw. The report described physical evidence with absolute confidence, yet the evidence itself had never been documented, preserved, or scientifically verified. A single document, accepted without question, would become the foundation of a conviction that would destroy an innocent man's life and force an entire justice system to confront one of its most embarrassing failures. By the time Ethan Brooks reached his 47th birthday, firefighting had become far more than a profession. It was the rhythm by which he measured his life. He often joked that he remembered major events not by holidays or birthdays, but by the fires he had responded to. His first apartment rescue. His first warehouse collapse. The apartment building where he carried 2 frightened children down 12 flights of smoke-filled stairs. The retirement home where an elderly woman hugged him so tightly after being rescued that she refused to let go until she had thanked every firefighter on the crew. Those memories stayed with him because they reminded him why he had chosen a career that demanded so much while offering so little recognition in return. Ethan had grown up in Tacoma, Washington, in a modest household where public service was never described as heroic. His father had worked as a city bus mechanic for more than 30 years, and his mother had spent most of her career as a public librarian. They believed that integrity was not something people spoke about. It was something they demonstrated through ordinary actions repeated every day. Ethan carried those values into adulthood. Friends often described him as the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, preferred practical solutions over dramatic speeches, and believed that every difficult situation could be made better if people remained calm long enough to think clearly. His colleagues admired him for reasons that rarely appeared in newspaper articles. Younger firefighters remembered how he stayed behind after training sessions to help them improve rescue techniques. Captains trusted him to lead difficult search operations because he never allowed panic to influence his decisions. During dangerous incidents, he had an unusual ability to reassure frightened civilians with nothing more than steady eye contact and a few carefully chosen words. In an occupation where confidence often determined survival, that quiet composure earned him enormous respect. Outside the fire station, Ethan lived an equally uncomplicated life. He shared a small home with his wife, Laura, a high school science teacher whose patience balanced his relentless work schedule. Together they had raised a daughter who had recently begun studying engineering at the University of Washington. Their evenings were rarely extraordinary. Most weekends were spent repairing things around the house, attending community events, or visiting Ethan's aging parents. To neighbors, the Brooks family represented stability. They were the people who remembered birthdays, volunteered at charity events, and never hesitated to help when someone on the street needed assistance. Nothing in Ethan's financial records suggested hidden debts. Nothing in his employment history indicated disciplinary action. Annual performance reviews consistently praised his professionalism, leadership, and sound judgment. Psychological evaluations conducted after several traumatic rescue operations concluded that he remained emotionally resilient and exceptionally reliable under pressure. Even detectives assigned to review his background privately admitted that his personal history did not resemble that of someone preparing to commit a violent crime. Yet investigations are often driven not by reputation, but by narrative. Once detectives became convinced that the warehouse fire had been deliberately started, every ordinary detail of Ethan's life began to be viewed through a different lens. Routine conversations became suspicious. Familiar relationships became possible conspiracies. Innocent decisions acquired sinister interpretations they had never possessed before. The public still saw a decorated firefighter. Investigators had already begun looking for something else, a suspect capable of fitting the theory they believed they had uncovered. Without realizing it, Ethan Brooks had already entered the most dangerous stage of any criminal investigation. It was the moment when evidence stopped shaping the investigation, and the investigation began shaping the evidence. In every major fire investigation, there comes a moment when the flames stop telling their story, and the evidence begins to speak. Burn patterns across concrete floors, melted electrical wiring, fractured window glass, collapsed roof trusses, and the smallest traces of chemical residue are carefully examined by specialists whose conclusions often determine whether a tragedy is remembered as an accident or prosecuted as a crime. Jurors rarely possess the technical knowledge to question these conclusions. They place their trust in experts who have spent years studying fire behavior, believing that science is objective, precise, and beyond personal opinion. 3 days after the warehouse fire, the Seattle Police Department requested assistance from one of the state's most respected fire investigators, Dr. Richard Harlow. With nearly 3 decades of experience and hundreds of investigations behind him, Harlow had built a reputation that commanded immediate confidence. Prosecutors admired his ability to explain complex forensic concepts in language that ordinary jurors could understand, while defense attorneys knew that challenging his testimony often proved difficult. His reports had influenced countless criminal cases, and judges frequently described him as an exceptionally credible expert witness. When Dr. Harlow entered the remains of the warehouse, most of the physical evidence had already been exposed to thousands of gallons of water, collapsing steel beams, and days of unstable environmental conditions. Even under ideal circumstances, reconstructing the origin of a large industrial fire is one of the most difficult tasks in forensic science. Small errors in interpretation can dramatically alter the final conclusion. Nevertheless, after spending less than 2 days examining the site, Harlow submitted a report that appeared remarkably confident. According to his findings, the fire had originated in a storage section on the eastern side of the building, where he claimed to have identified a distinctive burn pattern consistent with the use of a liquid accelerant. He further concluded that the intensity and direction of the flames could not reasonably be explained by accidental causes alone. To investigators eager for answers, the report appeared decisive. Detectives immediately began reconstructing Ethan Brooks' movements during the emergency response, searching for any opportunity that might explain how a firefighter could have started the blaze without attracting attention. Every dispatch record, radio transmission, vehicle log, and witness statement was reviewed with renewed urgency. Instead of asking whether Ethan could have committed the crime, investigators increasingly focused on explaining how he must have done it. The report contained another critical observation that would later become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Dr. Harlow wrote that chemical testing had confirmed microscopic traces of an industrial accelerant near the point of origin. The statement was presented as scientific fact. Detectives referenced it repeatedly during interviews, prosecutors highlighted it during press briefings, and local newspapers summarized it in headlines that left little room for doubt. To the public, the case seemed to have moved beyond suspicion. Science, they believed, had already established the truth. But hidden within the hundreds of pages of technical documentation was a detail that no one, not the detectives, not the prosecutors, not the defense, and not even the court, noticed at the time. Although the report confidently referred to laboratory confirmation, the evidence log contained no properly documented sample matching the material described by Dr. Harlow. There were photographs of debris, photographs of structural damage, and photographs of the collapsed storage area, but none showing the specific residue upon which such a significant conclusion depended. The laboratory records themselves appeared incomplete, yet no one questioned the omission because the reputation of the expert writing the report was considered proof enough. Years later, independent forensic specialists would describe that missing evidence as the single most important unanswered question in the entire investigation. If the accelerant had truly been present, where was the documented sample? If the laboratory had tested it, where were the complete chain of custody records? And if neither existed, how had one unsupported conclusion become the foundation of a murder conviction that would ultimately send an innocent firefighter to prison? At the time, however, no one asked those questions. The investigation continued, and the distance between Ethan Brooks and a criminal courtroom grew shorter with every passing day. For nearly 3 weeks after the warehouse fire, Ethan Brooks tried to return to the ordinary rhythm of his life. His shifts continued as scheduled, equipment inspections filled the early mornings, and emergency calls arrived with the same relentless unpredictability they always had. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. Yet beneath the routine, a quiet uneasiness had begun to grow. Detectives had contacted him twice for what they described as routine follow-up interviews. Their questions were polite, but they became increasingly specific. They wanted to know exactly where he had entered the warehouse, how long he had remained inside, who had been standing beside him during the initial attack, and whether he had ever met Daniel Mercer before that night. Ethan answered every question openly. He had spent his career believing that honest cooperation helped investigators uncover the truth. It never occurred to him that he was slowly becoming the center of their investigation. The third interview felt different from the moment he entered the room. The atmosphere was noticeably colder. 2 detectives were already waiting, and a thick folder rested on the table between them. For several minutes they repeated familiar questions before suddenly placing a series of aerial photographs from the warehouse in front of him. They pointed to an area near the eastern storage section and asked him to explain why witnesses believed he had remained there longer than any other firefighter. Ethan calmly explained that a partial roof collapse had blocked the original escape route, forcing his team to change direction while searching for possible victims. It was a standard tactical decision, one recorded in the department's incident log. The detectives listened without interruption, but their expressions revealed little. The conversation changed when one detective quietly slid a printed forensic report across the table. He tapped a highlighted paragraph and asked Ethan whether he knew what an accelerant burn pattern looked like. Ethan admitted that every firefighter received basic training in fire behavior, but determining the precise origin of a fire was the responsibility of forensic specialists, not emergency responders. The detective nodded before asking a question that caught Ethan completely off guard. If someone with your experience wanted to start a fire without attracting attention, would they know how? For several seconds, the room fell silent. Ethan stared at the detective, unsure whether he had heard the question correctly. It felt absurd. For 23 years, he had dedicated his life to preventing tragedies exactly like the one they were discussing. Now the very knowledge that had allowed him to save lives was being presented as evidence that he possessed the expertise to commit murder. As the interview continued, investigators introduced more pieces of what they believed was a compelling narrative. Phone records placed Ethan within the industrial district several hours before the fire. That was true. He had been inspecting emergency access routes during a scheduled departmental safety exercise. Financial documents showed he had recently refinanced his mortgage. That was also true. His daughter had begun university, and like thousands of American families, they had adjusted their finances to manage tuition costs. None of these facts were suspicious on their own, but together they were presented as fragments of a story that suggested hidden pressure and possible motive. When the interview finally ended, Ethan walked back to his truck convinced that the misunderstanding would soon be resolved. He believed investigators simply needed more time to examine the evidence objectively. What he did not know was that, at that very moment, prosecutors were already reviewing the case with the assumption that the forensic report had answered the most important question. In their minds, the investigation was no longer searching for the truth. It was preparing for trial. Early the following morning, local television stations interrupted their regular programming with breaking news. Anonymous sources within the investigation had revealed that detectives were focusing on a veteran firefighter as the primary suspect in the warehouse fire. Within hours, Ethan's photograph appeared across national news websites. Reporters gathered outside Fire Station 18. Television helicopters circled overhead as neighbors watched in disbelief. Some refused to believe the allegations. Others began asking questions that had never been asked before. The man who had spent 23 years arriving at emergencies to restore order suddenly found his own life descending into chaos. His uniform, once recognized as a symbol of trust, had become a source of suspicion. And before sunset that same day, detectives arrived at his front door carrying a warrant that would change the course of his life forever. The knock on Ethan Brooks' front door came at precisely 6:18 on a rainy Thursday morning. It was still dark outside. Seattle's autumn rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the coffee machine had only just begun to brew the first pot of the day. Ethan had been awake for less than 15 minutes, preparing for another 24-hour shift at Fire Station 18. His turnout bag rested beside the hallway door exactly where he had left it the night before. Like every working day for the past 23 years, he expected to spend the morning checking equipment, inspecting breathing apparatus, and responding to emergencies before most of the city had finished breakfast. Instead, he found 6 detectives standing silently on his front porch. No flashing lights, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, only a search warrant, an arrest warrant, and expressions that revealed none of them had come expecting a conversation. The lead detective introduced himself politely before informing Ethan that he was being arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder, aggravated arson, insurance fraud conspiracy, and destruction of evidence. For a brief moment, the words seemed almost impossible to understand. Ethan looked from one detective to another, waiting for someone to explain that a mistake had been made. No explanation came. The officers simply repeated the charges and asked him to place his hands where they could be seen. Laura Brooks appeared in the hallway, just as one of the detectives began reading the warrant aloud. She had spent nearly 25 years watching her husband leave home before sunrise to protect complete strangers. She had comforted him after fatal accidents, celebrated rescues that newspapers never reported, and accepted that every shift carried risks most families could never imagine. Yet nothing had prepared her for the sight of the man she trusted most standing silently in his own living room, while police officers treated him as though he were a dangerous criminal. Their daughter, Emily, heard the voices from upstairs and hurried toward the staircase, still wearing university sweatpants and carrying a textbook she had been studying the previous night. She froze halfway down the stairs as 2 detectives carefully escorted her father toward the front door. Ethan looked back only once. He managed a small, reassuring smile that carried far more confidence than he actually felt. "Everything's going to be okay," he said quietly. It was a sentence spoken more for his family's sake than his own. Outside, neighbors had already begun gathering beneath umbrellas along the opposite side of the street. Someone had alerted the media only minutes after the police convoy arrived. Camera crews were setting up across the road, their lenses fixed on the front steps. Reporters rehearsed opening lines while photographers waited for the front door to open. By the time Ethan emerged in handcuffs, the image had already become the day's biggest news story. The photograph spread across the country within hours. One picture appeared on nearly every newspaper's front page the following morning. It showed a firefighter in handcuffs, his head slightly lowered as detectives guided him toward an unmarked police vehicle. There was no context, no explanation, no reminder that only 3 weeks earlier the same man had been celebrated for rescuing victims from another apartment fire. The uniform that had once represented courage had been replaced by a pair of steel handcuffs that suggested guilt before any courtroom had heard a single piece of evidence. Inside police headquarters, Ethan's fingerprints were taken. His personal belongings were sealed inside clear evidence bags. His badge, station identification card, wedding ring, and watch were cataloged one item at a time. Procedures that detectives completed every day suddenly felt deeply personal when they were performed on someone who had spent his entire adult life working alongside law enforcement during emergencies. Meanwhile, prosecutors held a press conference less than 2 hours after the arrest. Standing before rows of microphones, they described the investigation as thorough, evidence-based, and supported by compelling forensic science. They thanked investigators for their professionalism and assured the public that the city had become safer because a dangerous individual was now in custody. The statement was broadcast live across regional and national news networks. Very few journalists questioned the evidence. Even fewer asked whether the accused firefighter had been presumed innocent. Public opinion shifted with astonishing speed. Social media filled with speculation, accusations, and outrage. Comment sections declared the case solved before formal charges had even been filed. Former rescue victims expressed disbelief, while others insisted they had always found Ethan too quiet or too calm. In the absence of facts, assumptions multiplied. By nightfall, Ethan Brooks had lost far more than his freedom. He had lost the reputation that had taken more than 2 decades to build. And although he did not yet realize it, reclaiming that reputation would prove far more difficult than walking out of prison. Because somewhere inside the thousands of pages of forensic reports, interview transcripts, and laboratory records was a single omission, so small that no one had noticed it, yet so significant that it would eventually unravel the entire prosecution. That discovery, however, was still many years away. The first morning of Ethan Brooks' trial began long before the courtroom doors opened to the public. Television crews had already positioned their cameras outside the King County Courthouse before sunrise, determined to capture every moment of what many newspapers were already calling the firefighter murder trial. Satellite trucks lined the streets surrounding the courthouse, reporters rehearsed live broadcasts beneath portable lights, and photographers waited patiently behind security barriers, hoping to capture a single image that could become the front page of the following day's newspapers. Inside the courthouse, however, the atmosphere was strikingly different. There were no flashing cameras or shouted questions. The marble corridors echoed only with the quiet footsteps of lawyers carrying heavy case files and court officers preparing for another day of proceedings. Justice, at least in appearance, moved with calm precision. Yet beneath that calm surface, the lives of dozens of people were about to be permanently changed. Ethan entered the courtroom wearing a dark navy suit that his wife had purchased years earlier for their daughter's high school graduation. It no longer fit as comfortably as it once had. Nearly 7 months had passed since his arrest, and the emotional weight of the investigation had become visible on his face. Friends who had known him for decades later recalled that he seemed older than his 47 years, as though every unanswered accusation had quietly taken something from him that sleep could never restore. Laura sat only a few feet behind the defense table. She held a small notebook in her hands, but never wrote a single word. Throughout the proceedings, her attention rarely shifted away from her husband. Their daughter Emily remained beside her, determined to attend every day of the trial despite postponing part of her university semester. She believed that if her father looked into the public gallery and saw his family waiting, he would remember that someone still believed in him, even if much of the city no longer did. Across the courtroom, prosecutors appeared remarkably confident. Their opening statement lasted nearly 90 minutes and unfolded with the precision of a carefully rehearsed narrative. Rather than beginning with uncertainty or unanswered questions, they presented the case as though its conclusion had already been reached. They described Ethan Brooks as a firefighter who possessed exceptional knowledge of fire behavior, suggesting that this expertise enabled him to disguise an intentional act of arson as a tragic accident. They argued that financial pressure had provided motive, professional experience had provided opportunity, and forensic science had provided proof. Each point flowed naturally into the next, creating a story that seemed complete before the first witness had even taken the stand. What made the prosecution particularly persuasive was not the quantity of evidence, but the confidence with which it was presented. Jurors were shown detailed diagrams of the warehouse, enlarged photographs of structural damage, digital reconstructions of the building, and animated simulations illustrating how investigators believed the fire had spread. The presentation was visually impressive. Every chart, every timeline, and every technical explanation appeared to reinforce the same conclusion. To 12 ordinary citizens with no formal training in fire investigation, it looked less like an allegation and more like established scientific fact. When the defense finally rose to deliver its opening statement, the tone could not have been more different. Ethan's attorney, Michael Reynolds, avoided dramatic language. He reminded the jury that criminal trials were not competitions between stories but careful examinations of evidence. He acknowledged the tragedy of Daniel Mercer's death and expressed sympathy for the victim's family before turning his attention toward the forensic investigation itself. Reynolds explained that his defense would not rely on speculation or emotional appeals. Instead, it would ask a much simpler question. Could every scientific conclusion presented by the prosecution actually be supported by documented evidence? It was a subtle argument, almost understated compared to the prosecution's dramatic presentation. Some courtroom observers later admitted they barely noticed its importance. Others assumed it was simply another routine defense strategy. Yet that single question would eventually become the foundation upon which the entire case collapsed. Over the following days, prosecutors called firefighters, police officers, laboratory technicians, and emergency dispatch personnel. Each witness added another small piece to the narrative already forming inside the minds of the jurors. None of them claimed to have seen Ethan start the fire. None possessed direct evidence connecting him to the victim before the incident. Nevertheless, every testimony seemed to strengthen the credibility of the forensic report that stood at the center of the prosecution's case. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of testimony, the courtroom reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The bailiff called the next witness. The state calls Dr. Richard Harlow. As the respected fire investigator walked toward the witness stand carrying a thick binder of reports and diagrams, the courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Even veteran reporters stopped typing. They understood that the outcome of the trial might depend less on every witness who had testified before him than on the authority of the man who was about to explain why science, in his opinion, proved that the fire had been deliberately set. For Ethan Brooks, the trial had entered its most dangerous chapter. When Dr. Richard Harlow stepped into the witness box, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed almost immediately. Throughout the trial, jurors had listened carefully to firefighters, police officers, emergency dispatchers, and laboratory technicians, but everyone understood that this testimony carried a different kind of weight. Witnesses could describe what they had seen. Detectives could explain what they had investigated, but only a forensic expert could persuade a jury that science itself had identified the person responsible for the fire. For nearly 30 years, Dr. Harlow had built a reputation that few investigators could match. His resume filled page after page with professional certifications, advanced training courses, and appearances as an expert witness in major criminal trials across the United States. Judges had repeatedly accepted his opinions without objection. Prosecutors described him as one of the country's leading authorities on fire investigation, and newspapers had occasionally referred to him as the man who could read the story hidden inside the ashes. Long before he spoke his first word, the jury already regarded him as someone whose conclusions deserved extraordinary trust. The prosecutor began with simple questions, carefully establishing Harlow's qualifications before moving into the science of fire behavior. Using enlarged diagrams projected onto digital screens throughout the courtroom, Harlow explained how experienced investigators determine a fire's point of origin. He described burn patterns, heat movement, ventilation effects, flashover conditions, and the ways in which different construction materials respond to extreme temperatures. His explanations were calm, methodical, and remarkably easy to understand. Jurors nodded as they followed each illustration. Even members of the public gallery appeared captivated by the clarity of his testimony. Only then did the prosecution turn to the warehouse fire. Standing beside a detailed floor plan of the building, Dr. Harlow pointed toward the eastern storage section and explained that this location displayed what he believed to be unmistakable signs of deliberate ignition. According to his interpretation, the fire had burned with an intensity inconsistent with an accidental electrical malfunction. He testified that irregular burn patterns on the concrete floor suggested the presence of an accelerant, and stated that laboratory analysis had confirmed microscopic traces of an industrial solvent commonly associated with intentional fires. Every conclusion was delivered with unwavering confidence. There was no hesitation in his voice, no suggestion that alternative explanations remained possible. To anyone listening, his testimony sounded less like professional opinion and more like scientific certainty. The prosecutor then asked the question that would become the defining moment of the trial. Dr. Harlow, based upon your investigation and your professional experience, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty regarding how this fire began? The courtroom fell completely silent. Harlow adjusted his glasses, looked briefly toward the jury, and answered with measured confidence. Yes, I do. In my professional opinion, this fire was intentionally set. The words echoed through the courtroom with astonishing force. Several jurors instinctively looked toward Ethan Brooks before returning their attention to the witness stand. Reporters sitting in the press section immediately began typing. Family members of Daniel Mercer lowered their heads. Laura Brooks quietly reached for her daughter's hand beneath the wooden bench. Ethan himself remained expressionless, staring at the witness without speaking. Years later, he would say that this was the exact moment he realized the trial was no longer about discovering the truth. It had become a battle against a conclusion that already seemed impossible to challenge. The prosecution continued building upon Harlow's testimony. They displayed photographs of blackened concrete, fragments of twisted steel, and computer-generated reconstructions illustrating how investigators believed the flames had spread throughout the warehouse. One by one, each visual presentation appeared to reinforce the same narrative. To the jury, everything seemed to fit together perfectly. The expert had identified the point of origin. Laboratory testing had supposedly confirmed the presence of an accelerant. Investigators had focused on a firefighter with extensive knowledge of fire behavior. The prosecution's theory appeared complete. Yet beneath the confidence of the testimony lay a problem so subtle that no one inside the courtroom recognized it. As Harlow referred repeatedly to laboratory confirmation, he never identified the specific evidence sample that had produced those results. He mentioned chemical analysis, but did not display the chain of custody records. He described microscopic residue, but did not present photographs showing exactly where it had been collected. Every statement sounded authoritative, yet each relied upon documentation that remained strangely absent from the evidence presented before the jury. At the time, no one questioned those omissions. The prosecutor certainly did not. The judge saw no reason to interrupt. The jurors had no technical expertise to notice what was missing. And the defense, despite growing concerns, had not yet uncovered the inconsistency hidden within thousands of pages of investigative records. When Dr. Harlow finally stepped down from the witness stand late that afternoon, many courtroom observers believed they had just witnessed the strongest testimony of the entire trial. What they did not know was that the very evidence inspiring so much confidence would eventually become the reason Ethan Brooks walked free. For nearly 3 weeks, the prosecution had controlled the rhythm of the trial. Every witness had strengthened the same narrative, every exhibit had appeared to support the conclusions reached by investigators, and every passing day seemed to move the jury one step closer to believing that Ethan Brooks had deliberately set the warehouse on fire. Outside the courthouse, news commentators were already debating how long his prison sentence might be. Very few people still questioned whether he was guilty. The conversation had quietly shifted from whether he committed the crime to how severely he should be punished. Inside the courtroom, however, the defense team had been spending every evening reviewing thousands of pages of technical reports, laboratory records, and evidence inventories. Attorney Michael Reynolds had developed an uneasy feeling that something about the forensic investigation did not fit together. It was not a dramatic inconsistency that immediately stood out, nor was it a witness changing their testimony. Instead, it was a subtle absence, one small detail that continued to appear whenever the prosecution discussed scientific evidence, yet strangely disappeared whenever the original documentation was examined. When court resumed the following morning, Reynolds stood and approached the witness stand carrying a thin blue folder. Unlike the prosecution's heavy binders filled with enlarged photographs and colorful diagrams, this folder appeared almost insignificant. It contained only a handful of documents, each carefully marked with small adhesive notes. To most observers in the courtroom, it hardly looked capable of changing anything. Reynolds began politely, thanking Dr. Richard Harlow for his years of public service before asking a series of straightforward questions about standard investigative procedures. He invited the expert to explain how evidence should normally be collected at a fire scene, how samples are labeled before being transported to a laboratory, and why maintaining an uninterrupted chain of custody is essential to preserving scientific integrity. Harlow answered confidently. These were basic principles of forensic investigation, concepts he had explained countless times throughout his career. The attorney nodded respectfully after each response, allowing the jury to hear the procedures directly from the expert himself. Every answer reinforced the impression that fire investigations followed strict scientific standards designed to prevent mistakes. Only then did Reynolds slowly change direction. "Dr. Harlow," he asked, "you testified yesterday that laboratory analysis confirmed the presence of an industrial accelerant near the point of origin. Could you please identify the evidence sample number associated with that laboratory result?" The question sounded almost routine. Harlow glanced toward the prosecution table before opening the binder resting in front of him. Several seconds passed. He turned another page, then another. Finally, he adjusted his glasses and quietly admitted that he did not remember the specific evidence number from memory. The prosecutor immediately objected, arguing that the witness could simply consult his report. The judge allowed it. Harlow searched again. More pages turned. The courtroom remained silent except for the faint rustling of paper. After nearly a minute, he located the laboratory section of the report and identified what he believed to be the corresponding exhibit reference. Reynolds thanked him, walked calmly to the evidence display, and projected the official evidence inventory onto the courtroom screen. The document listed every physical item collected from the warehouse: charred electrical wiring, fragments of steel beams, burned insulation, concrete samples, pieces of melted plastic, photographic storage media, protective equipment. Dozens of carefully cataloged exhibits appeared one after another. But the sample number Dr. Harlow had just identified was nowhere on the list. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Reynolds paused for several moments before speaking again. "Dr. Harlow, could you help the jury understand why the sample you just identified does not appear anywhere in the official evidence inventory?" For the first time since taking the witness stand, the veteran expert hesitated. He looked toward the screen, then toward his own report, finally back toward the attorney. His confident expression began to fade. He explained that the numbering system may have changed during laboratory processing. Reynolds immediately displayed the laboratory chain of custody records. Those records used exactly the same numbering system. Again, the sample could not be found. Jurors began leaning forward in their seats. Even reporters stopped typing. The prosecutor's expression changed almost instantly. What had started as an ordinary technical question was beginning to expose something no one had anticipated. Reynolds continued carefully, never raising his voice. "Without a documented evidence sample, can this jury independently verify that the material you described was ever collected from the warehouse?" Another long silence followed. Dr. Harlow answered carefully, "Not from the documents currently before the court." The words were quiet, but their impact was enormous. For the first time since the trial had begun, uncertainty entered the prosecution's case. The defense was not claiming the expert had intentionally lied. It was presenting something potentially even more troubling: that the most important scientific conclusion in the entire investigation might have been accepted without the documentation required to prove it. As court adjourned later that afternoon, journalists rushed from the courtroom to update their reports. Until that day, headlines had focused almost entirely on Ethan Brooks. Now, for the first time, the story was no longer only about the firefighter on trial. It had become a story about the evidence itself. And once a jury begins questioning the evidence, every verdict becomes uncertain. When the closing arguments finally came to an end, the courtroom seemed to exhale for the first time in weeks. Every piece of evidence had been presented. Every witness had spoken. Every theory had been argued. The responsibility now rested with 12 ordinary citizens who had spent nearly 2 months listening to technical testimony, emotional appeals, and competing interpretations of the same tragic event. For Ethan Brooks, the wait felt longer than the entire trial itself. He sat quietly beside his attorney, staring at the empty jury box while the courtroom slowly emptied around him. Laura remained close, holding his hand in silence. Neither of them tried to predict what would happen next. After months of public accusations and weeks of courtroom testimony, They had reached the point where hope itself had become exhausting. Nearly 14 hours later, the jury returned. Everyone stood. The foreperson unfolded a single sheet of paper. The courtroom became completely silent. On the charge of first-degree murder, the jurors found Ethan Brooks guilty. On the charge of aggravated arson, guilty. Laura lowered her head. Emily began crying quietly behind her. Ethan never looked away from the jury. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, took a slow breath, and accepted the words that would redefine the rest of his life. Several weeks later, the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 28 years. Outside the courthouse, reporters described the verdict as another victory for forensic science. News broadcasts praised investigators for solving what had once seemed like an impossible case. Editorials called the outcome proof that no one, not even a decorated firefighter, was above the law. Within days, the city moved on. The warehouse was demolished. The headlines disappeared. A new fire station captain replaced Ethan Brooks. Life continued for everyone, except the man whose life had been frozen inside a prison cell. Prison changed Ethan in ways that no courtroom ever could. The first months were the hardest. Every morning he woke expecting to hear emergency dispatch tones, only to remember that the only sounds around him were metal doors, echoing corridors, and prison announcements. For someone who had spent 23 years running toward emergencies to save lives, the helplessness was almost unbearable. Yet even behind prison walls, old habits refused to disappear. He began teaching literacy classes to inmates who had never finished high school. Later, he volunteered in emergency medical training programs inside the correctional facility. Correctional officers noticed that arguments often ended when Ethan was present. In a place built around punishment, he quietly continued serving others. Laura never missed a monthly visit. Emily completed her engineering degree despite working 2 jobs to pay tuition after losing much of the family's savings during the trial. Every visit ended the same way. "We'll keep fighting." And every month, Ethan answered with the same quiet smile. I know. Almost 11 years after the conviction, something happened that no one expected. The Washington Innocence Review Project accepted Ethan's case. Not because they believed dramatic new evidence had appeared. Not because someone had confessed. But because a young legal researcher named Rachel Kim noticed something remarkably simple while reviewing thousands of archived documents. The forensic report repeatedly referred to an evidence sample that seemed to exist everywhere, except inside the official evidence records. Rachel assumed it was merely a filing mistake. She requested the original laboratory archives. Nothing. She requested the property room inventory. Nothing. She requested transportation logs from the fire scene. Nothing. For 6 weeks, she searched every available database. The sample simply did not exist. At first, she believed records had been lost. Then she made a discovery that changed everything. The laboratory scientist whose name appeared beside the chemical analysis had retired years earlier. When investigators finally interviewed him, he quietly explained that he had never tested the sample described in Dr. Harlow's report. He remembered receiving several pieces of debris from the warehouse, but none matching the exhibit number listed during the trial. The number itself had never existed inside the laboratory's system. The prosecution's most important scientific conclusion had not been supported by fabricated laboratory results. It had been supported by something even more dangerous, an assumption that had gradually transformed into accepted fact because no one had ever demanded to see the original evidence. Within months, independent fire experts re-examined every surviving photograph, structural drawing, and investigative note from the warehouse. Their conclusions differed dramatically from those presented during the original trial. Several burn patterns previously interpreted as evidence of accelerant were now recognized as ordinary effects of flashover, a phenomenon that had become far better understood through advances in modern fire science. Electrical engineers also concluded that aging industrial wiring inside the warehouse provided a completely plausible accidental cause for the fire. One by one, the pillars supporting the conviction began to collapse. The prosecution eventually acknowledged that it could no longer defend the verdict with confidence. 11 years after Ethan Brooks entered prison, the judge who reviewed the new evidence issued a decision that lasted less than 15 minutes. The conviction was vacated. All criminal charges were dismissed. Ethan Brooks was free. When he stepped outside the correctional facility, there were no cheering crowds waiting for him. No television helicopters. No city officials offering public apologies. Only Laura, Emily, and a handful of former firefighters who had refused to believe he was guilty. For several moments, no one spoke. Laura simply wrapped her arms around her husband. Emily held his hand exactly as she had done during the trial more than a decade earlier. The cameras captured the reunion, but they could never capture the years that had been stolen. The birthdays missed, the anniversaries forgotten, the ordinary mornings that prison had quietly erased forever. Months later, Seattle officially restored Ethan's pension and formally recognized his years of service. The city apologized. The fire department apologized. The prosecutor's office apologized. But as Ethan stood before reporters during his first public interview after his release, he offered no words of anger. Instead, he said something that left the room completely silent. Justice is not only about correcting a mistake. Justice is about having the courage to admit that a mistake was made before another innocent person pays the same price. Those words spread across the country, not because they erased what had happened, but because they reminded people of something every justice system must remember. Evidence is only as trustworthy as the care with which it is examined. Experts can be respected. Investigators can be experienced. Jurors can be sincere. Judges can act in good faith. And yet, when one unsupported assumption is accepted as unquestionable truth, an innocent life can disappear behind prison walls. For 11 years, Ethan Brooks lost his freedom because of evidence that never truly existed. His story reminds us that justice does not fail only when people lie. Sometimes, justice fails because no one stops to ask the simplest question of all. Can anyone prove this evidence was ever really there?